And if you look at the big ag companies like Deere, Kubota, AGCO, these guys all have hundreds of data analysts now. And what you're seeing is that the manufacturers of yesterday are becoming the technology companies of tomorrow.
Die Geldmeisterin. Der Finanzpodcast. Mit Julia Kistner.
Und mit Robin Black, Fondsmanager bei Aegon Asset Management, der sich rechtzeitig zur Grünen Messe in Berlin, der größten Agrarmesse der Welt, für die Geldmeisterin vielversprechende Agrartechnologie-Aktien angeschaut hat. AgTech sind jene Firmen, die Technologie in die Landwirtschaft bringen, damit diese auch die aktuell 7,6 Milliarden große Weltbevölkerung ernähren kann, die laut Vereinten Nationen bis 2050 auf 9 Milliarden und bis 2100 auf 11 bis 12 Milliarden ansteigt. Doch bevor wir das Feld der Agraraktien umpflügen, hier noch eine große Bitte in eigener Sache. Ich würde mich riesig freuen, wenn ihr beim Ö3 Podcast Award noch diese Woche einen oder alle meine 3 Podcasts, Geldmeisterin, Börsenminute und oder auf Trab, eure Stimme gibt. Vielen Dank dafür. Den Link zum Award findet ihr hier in den Shownotes, sprich dem Beipackzettel zu dieser Podcast-Folge. So, aber jetzt zu Robin.
Thank you, Robin, for taking your time, and please briefly introduce yourself to the podcast audience.
So, my name's Robin Black. I'm a global investment manager at Aegon Asset Management, and I invest funds on behalf of our clients.
3.5 billion people live on Earth. Nowadays, we have almost 6.6 billion human beings on the planet, and the UN estimates in 2100 it will be about 11 to 12 billion inhabitants. Will we be capable to feed the world? And do you see there a mega trend also for investing? Is our agriculture efficient enough?
Yeah, I mean, you raise a lot of different points there.
Yeah.
I suppose, first of all, on the population, I mean, clearly it's growing. It's grown dramatically. And like you say, the UN forecasts are very punchy in terms of the amount of people who will be on Earth. Mm-hmm. I think it is worth mentioning, even though I'm not a demographer, that the UN forecasts are generally some of the higher forecasts on the street, and that generally demographic predictions have been coming down of late. But it does seem clear to me that we'll have over 10 billion people in the world at some stage, probably the end of the century. Mm-hmm. And it's very clear there's going to be an enormous demand for food. Mm-hmm. I've seen a demand figure suggesting that by 2050, demand for food will be 70% higher than it was in 2010. So things are changing very fast.
So how can we feed all the inhabitants of the earth?
I mean, that's the key question. And it's going to depend on several different factors. So obviously one of them is, what will the actual peak population be? Mm-hmm. Also, I think, what will we eat? I mean, will we eat differently? And it's become clear that eating patterns are changing, and some of the more intensive products, such as cattle, are becoming less popular. Mm-hmm. And you're seeing a decline in red meat consumption across the developed world. So eating patterns will be important. Mm-hmm. Agricultural technology will be important. And I can outline some of those later on, yes, some of the developments there. How do you transport the food? How do you store it? Mm-hmm. Things like that, very important. How equitably will we share the food? You know, will the developed markets keep them to itself, or will we share it with more emerging countries? Mm-hmm. And another factor that I think people don't talk about enough is the amount of land available. Mm-hmm. But that's been declining, and global cropland per capita has halved since the 60s. So another part of the equation, will we have enough food to feed everyone, is the amount of land available.
These are so many questions. So how can you invest then in this area?
Yeah, I mean, there's several different ways of doing it. You could obviously own a company which has land. That's not the route we go. we tend to invest in what we call agricultural technology companies.
Yeah.
And AgTech is a big theme, and it's evolving quite quickly just now. Well, I mean, I can talk you through some of the things that are developing in automation within agricultural technology. So you'll be aware that there's a need to replace labor. I mean, the number of people working in agriculture has been declining quite dramatically. For example, in Japan, where we own an agricultural stock, the number of people working in agriculture has declined by 35% within the last decade. And with 70% of farmers over 65, that's only going to get worse. So you need technology to replace people, and you need technology to drive efficiencies to ensure that there's enough food for us all. So you'll be aware of some of the more obvious things in technology. So, for example, more efficient fuel use in machinery like tractors and combine harvesters. And ideally, you can use less fuel, but over time, there's a lot of investment going in to ensure that you could use hydrogen-powered machinery or electric tractors. These type of things are developing. And they're not particularly high-tech. I mean, obviously, there's a development going on. But these are things that all your readers and listeners will be well aware of. Also, things like sealant systems. And I think people concentrate very much on the food itself, but the storage and the transportation part of it is very important because a lot of food gets wasted. So if you've got better sealant systems on your grain bins, for example, you can store. Or stronger water pipes. Again, it doesn't sound like high tech, but if you've got stronger water pipes that can withstand earthquakes and typhoons, then you're going to have less water leakage. And again, that leads to more efficient production. But technology has moved beyond what I've just described. Precision planting, for example. So, if you've got a machine that's planting seed, this was something that hundreds of years ago was done by hand, and you try and approximate the best time to do it, and you try and approximate where to put each seed and keep it reasonably even. But now, of course, it's all done by data, computer, and you can analyze the soil and work out the best time to plant and how deep to plant the seed. And of course, because it's being done by a machine, it's very evenly planted. So optimal planting is one thing. Optimal spraying is another. You used to just take out your pesticides and blast it and hope that it would have a positive impact. But now it's very targeted, and that's led to chemical reduction of up to 80%. Or autonomous driving is another one. If a tractor or a combine is going in a straight line, that's obviously much more efficient than if it weaves. And autonomous driving is quite difficult in agriculture because there's a lot of bumps and hills and uneven things. So it's harder to do ADAS than it is on roads for normal cars. But that's been coming along as well. And I think a lot of the data analysis is key. So weather, soil analysis, when to plant, when to harvest. And if you look at the big ag companies like Deere, Kubota, AGCO, these guys all have hundreds of data analysts now. And what you're seeing is that the manufacturers of yesterday are becoming the technology companies of tomorrow.
That's really interesting. The companies you just mentioned, these are the classical agriculture machinery companies. Are these the key players in this automatization and artificial intelligence and Internet of Things?
Yeah, well, what you find is with a lot of things in investment, you can get exposure to a theme, but it's not very pure exposure. Yeah. So, for example, a semiconductor company like TSMC, they'll make a lot of the semiconductors that go into smart agriculture, but it's not very pure play because the semiconductors go into a lot of other things as well. Or the efficient steel companies, companies that make high quality, efficient, lighter steel, that again will be helping AgTech, but again, it's not a very pure play. So in terms of getting a pure play, it is the names that we've discussed. It's companies like Kubota, AGCO, Deere, and they do have a lot of the technologies. And because, of course, they're big companies, they've got a lot of cumulative R&D invested in all of these things that we've discussed.
But these are all not companies from Europe. The Kubota is Japanese, I think, and the others are Americans. Is this right?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, obviously, Europe has companies as well. So, for example, CNH Industrial, they would be a competitor to Kubota and to Deere.
What about another mega trend? You just mentioned that we don't have enough farmland. What about indoor farming? Is this also AgTech, or is this something else?
In its most basic form, you'd struggle to call it tech. I mean, near to where I live, you get plastic tunnels that go over fruit and veg, and that extends the season by several weeks, which obviously has its benefits in terms of optimal harvesting time. Now that's an old technology, easily done, but it is, and it's not fully indoor, but it's a sort of hybrid version where you're working to control the temperature. If you want to go fully indoor, it has a lot of benefits and a lot of costs. Now, the benefits are superb. You know, you can control the climate to the closest decimal point in terms of your temperature. You're not going to have any exposure to pesticides. Quite simply, you're the boss, and you're not at the behest of nature. The problem is, it costs a lot of money. In terms of energy, in terms of building construction, and I think the jury's out in terms of whether the trade-off is worth it in terms of how energy efficient it is. So I think you're more likely to get a sort of hybrid type solution, maybe a bit more advanced than plastic tunnels, but probably not sort of huge, intensive buildings.
So we won't see farming in a huge dimension underground? Underground
is not something I've ever discussed with any of our investments. It's not something I'm aware is a particularly close concept. And just thinking about it off the top of my head, I mean, the costs involved would presumably be very pronounced. But I'm sure that every stone will go turned while we're trying to work out how to feed the world. And what I do know is, and this is one thing that gives me great optimism, one of the solutions, or many of the solutions that will ensure that there's food for people in 2050 and 2100 haven't been developed yet. And this could be one of those things that over time, maybe the economics of it or the feasibility of it changes. But it's not an active discussion with any of the companies we know or any of the farmers I know.
And what about genetic engineering? It was very popular, and now you don't hear much about it.
Yeah, I'm not. It's very contentious. And I wonder if that's why you don't hear so much about it. People who are doing it don't want to draw attention to it.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting one. There's clearly a very strong case for it, because obviously if you can help crops become virus resistant, if you can delay the ripening of products, if you can make them larger, if you can make them more reliable, there has to be a case to suggest that's going to help our food shortage problems. But, and there is a big but, it is controversial. Some people fear it's unnatural and that it's unsafe. So it's a bit of a trade-off, a bit like indoor farming. My guess would be that it will play a role in the future. It might be something more like gene editing, which is somewhat lighter version than GM. So you work with very similar genes from the same species rather than introducing foreign types of species. And that may be more sort of palatable to those who object. So you might end up with some sort of compromise. But I'm pretty confident it will be part of the future. But it will probably be down more to politicians and public opinion rather than scientists how much it's part of the future.
And what else are the mega trends in modern agriculture? Is it the vegetable food or resistant seed or what else?
Yeah, all of that. I mean, resistant seed is clearly something that I put into the AgTech part of developments and pesticide, these sort of things. Trying to protect your seed is clearly one. I think human behavioral pattern is one. So eating less red meat, and you've now got listed companies on stock markets which produce plant-based burgers. And I've tried them. I don't think they're the same as normal burgers, but I think they're getting there. And I think over time they'll get closer and closer. But that's expensive, though. It's not a economically viable competitor at this stage. But of course, new technologies never are. So over time, I would expect more plant-based food. Soy milk continues to be more popular. And if you look at the trends over time, I wouldn't say it's growing fast, but it is certainly growing. And I think people are just more aware of the health implications of eating too much red meat. So maybe they're not necessarily trying to change the environment. Maybe they're just trying to help themselves. But it has the same impact. And I do think that red meat consumption per capita is coming down. And obviously vegetarianism and veganism does continue to be a genuine lifestyle choice, and probably less on the fringes than it used to be 20, 30, 40 years ago.
So you see in Beyond Meat, etc., the future? It's just a question of price right now, a price competition?
Well, yeah, I mean, Beyond Meat doesn't make any money.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty big problem for a fund manager. So, and this is what I'm saying. So a lot of these things, you're going to have to hit critical mass. The technologies are going to have to develop. So I don't own any shares in Beyond Meat. I think you're paying for the future a bit there. But I admire what they're trying to do. And I think at the right price, when it's making money, it could be Beyond Meat or a similar type of company. It could be a super investment.
So where do you see the investment opportunities right now and not in the future?
Well, for us, the funds that I'm involved in have shares in Kubota, which is a Japanese agricultural machinery company. I've mentioned that a couple of times on this call. And also AGCO, which is a direct competitor to Deere. They do pretty similar things, but it's a lot cheaper than Deere. So the multiple's a lot lower. And I'm a pretty price-sensitive investor. So AGCO appealed to me more than Deere, although I do think that Deere is a super company.
As a final flashlight, you can say either or. Do you see more potential in indoor farming or more intensive use of agricultural area?
I say the latter, intensive use of agricultural area.
Commodity fund or investments in agricultural area?
Well, that's difficult. Both are good. I think commodities are going to remain very much in demand over the next 50, 100 years. So, yeah, commodities.
Future of farming, do you see this in the USA, in Japan, China, or in Europe?
USA.
And why? Because they have difficulties to find labor?
No, I think labor hopefully will become less of an issue because of some of the technologies discussed. I think in terms of how the agricultural land itself is laid out, the US is more efficient than Europe. You asked about China. I think you've got certain efficiency issues, not just in the actual manufacture, but in the storage, distribution. And Japan has its own issues in terms of intense demographic pressures and also less land per capita.
As you mentioned several times, storage. Can you give me an idea what kind of companies these are, which are good in this area?
Yeah, well, this is what I was talking about earlier in terms of finding pure plays. It's very difficult. So I don't know any pure plays in agricultural storage. I do know companies that make PVC, for example, which will be an important part of a storage infrastructure, but they're not pure plays.
Okay.
They may exist, but we don't own them.
But you try to find pure plays, or?
Not necessarily. I mean, we own many semiconductor companies that will go into smart agriculture. But for the purpose of this discussion, clearly things like Kubota, Deere, they're all more relevant companies. They're much more direct plays, yes.
Do you see globalization of agriculture or more protection in food production?
I wish we'd see globalization.
Yeah.
Because that's where the efficiencies lie. Going all the way back to Adam Smith, we all know that. But the reality is, if we look at the noise out of Russia, out of certain American politicians like ex-President Trump, it seems that we've possibly seen peak globalization for a while just now.
And agricultural investments, do you think they are sustainable or not?
Yeah, I do. I think things like GM is a bit of a debate, and some people are for it and some people are against it. But in terms of efficiency of machinery, safety of machinery, I can't really see a case where you would argue against it or say there isn't a sustainable argument. So, yes, very much so.
And do you see sustainable arguments in investing directly in commodities?
That's harder. No. Sustainable is a very tricky one because it depends on your definition of the word. But broadly, certainly at Aegon, we broadly shy away from big commodity companies and oil companies for our sustainable funds.
And do you have a special sustainable agricultural fund? No.
No, we have several responsible investment funds. We have a global sustainable fund, but it doesn't concentrate solely on agriculture. It concentrates on things which it thinks makes a positive difference to the world, but it doesn't solely concentrate on agriculture.
Do you have a known fund which just concentrates on agro-farming?
No.
But you think it's important that this is one of the mega trends you should have in your portfolio, or?
I think that's right. I think it's a very good thing to have in our portfolio because it's going to grow over time. And it's pretty clear you've got a good tailwind there. So I would not discourage anyone from owning a sort of high quality ag company. The issue with a specific fund is there aren't that many large liquid pure plays. And then you end up owning sort of impure plays or companies that you wouldn't buy other than to try and create a fund. I'm not convinced that there's enough listed names out there to have a pure fund, although they no doubt exist.
And do you see, besides AgTech, other mega trends in investing?
Yes, many. I mean, a big one is factory automation. And I guess that's somewhat related in terms of replacing human labor, bringing efficiencies and safety to process. But this, of course, is a process in a factory rather than on a field. But yeah, factory automation, I think, is huge. And we own several robotic companies. And also, I think, semiconductor companies and technology companies, but semis in particular, because semiconductors go into pretty much everything we're going to be using over the coming years.
So isn't it a good time to invest there now, because the semiconductor companies and the tech companies in general came down quite a lot this year?
Yeah, that's right. You've seen a reasonable correction in quite a lot of stocks globally as the Federal Reserve Bank started to raise rates. So the debate is, have they come back far enough? Now, of course, the bears would say the US Fed has not finished hiking, nor have other central banks. Japan's hardly even started. India went again today. ECB's got further to go. B of E's got further to go. Consumers under pressure. Fuel costs are high, and job cuts are coming. So, and 2023 will see a recession, maybe a shallow one, maybe a slightly deeper one. So you can make a pretty bearish case.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, as you correctly observe, markets have come back quite far, and several sort of high quality companies are probably trading 30, 40% lower than where they were at the peak. So you're on a bit of a knife edge just now. And I guess you sort of Americans talk in terms of innings, where are we in the innings of the correction?
Yeah.
And I would guess you're sort of the 7th or 8th innings. That's my sense.
So if you want to follow megatrends, you can't do this without technology, or are there any megatrends which are not in this area, which needs a lot of capital?
I think the big ones that certainly on investment point that we tend to have are technology, agriculture, and factory automation. So I think those probably are the main ones.
Über aktuelle Börsenaufreger und Ereignisse berichtet Werktag für Werktag übrigens die kleine Podcast-Schwester der Geldmeisterin, die Börsenminute. Überall, wo es Podcasts gibt, auf YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, Xing und auch auf www.geldmeisterin.com. Eine erfolgreiche Anlagewoche wünscht euch die Geldmeisterin und Julia Kistner. Und am Schluss noch der Disclaimer. An dieser Stelle wie immer der wichtige Hinweis, dass die Inhalte dieses Podcasts, der Videos und der Webseite geldmeisterin.com ausschließlich der allgemeinen Information dienen und die ganz persönliche Meinung der Geldmeisterin und von Julia sind. Es handelt sich keinesfalls um Investmentempfehlungen, Rechts- oder Anlageberatungen. Das Gesagte, Geschriebene und Dargestellte kann und soll auch nicht das persönliche Gespräch mit deiner Finanzberaterin ersetzen. Auch sind weder die Geldmeisterin noch Julia Kistner informiert darüber, wie es mit deiner Vermögenssituation ausschaut, deinen Bedürfnissen, familiären Umständen, deinem Finanzwissen, die Risikoneigung oder deinen Anlagehorizont. Anlegen erfolgt daher auf eigene Gefahr. Die Geldmeisterin und Julia Kistner haften nicht für Anlageentscheidungen, die aufgrund ihrer Medienbeiträge getroffen werden. Kurzum, für die Geldmeisterin und Julia Kistner war es immer ein Vergnügen, dich bei deinem Vermögensaufbau zu inspirieren. Auf deinen eigenen, persönlich richtigen Geldesel musst du schon selbst setzen. Viel Erfolg!